Being a knight in the Middle Ages might sound like a dream straight out of a storybook. Gleaming armor, gallant horses, epic quests, and the admiration of lords and ladies, it all paints a picture of honor and grandeur. But the reality of a knight's life was far more complex. Beneath the romantic tales of chivalry and dragon slaying was a life filled with intense training, brutal warfare, rigid discipline, and responsibilities that extended far beyond the battlefield. To truly understand what it was like to be a knight, you have to set aside the fantasy and step into the stirrups of someone who lived by the sword. The journey began in childhood. Knights weren't born with swords in their hands. They were molded through years of disciplined training. A boy destined for knighthood typically began his path around the age of 7. At this young age, he became a page, serving in a noble household. His tasks included running errands, cleaning weapons, learning basic swordplay, and developing manners and etiquette. The life of a page was less about glory and more about obedience. He was taught to ride, hunt, read religious texts, and respect authority's essential traits for any future knight. 8. By the time he reached his teenage years, around 14, he would be promoted to squire. This was when the real training began. As a squire, he served directly under a knight, learning the intricacies of combat and warfare. He was responsible for his knight's armor, weapons, and horse. He followed him into battles, tournaments, and long journeys. In many ways, he was an apprentice and a shadow, observing everything, assisting with everything, and slowly earning the right to call himself a warrior. It wasn't uncommon for a squire to experience real combat before becoming a knight. Life was dangerous, and in times of war, a squire was expected to step up. If he proved himself worthy, he would eventually be knighted. This wasn't just a promotion, it was a sacred ceremony. Often performed in a church, the knighting ritual involved a solemn oath to uphold the values of courage, loyalty, and justice. Some ceremonies included a night of prayer, a symbolic bath representing purity, and a final blow to the neck or shoulder known as the accolade to mark the transition. When he rose from his knees, he was no longer a boy in training, he was a knight of the realm. Now the real work began. Knights were the elite warriors of their time, but their role wasn't limited to swinging swords. They were also landowners, tax collectors, judges, and local enforcers of law and order. They had to manage estates, protect the peasants under their care, and serve their liege lord when called upon. This could mean joining a military campaign, riding to the defense of a castle, or settling disputes between vassals. The knight's duty was to serve, and that service was constant. War was a grim reality. When knights went to battle, they didn't charge blindly into glory. Medieval warfare was grueling and chaotic. Armor was heavy and hot. Weapons were brutal. Injuries were often fatal, and even if you survived the fight, infection could kill you days later. Knights fought on horseback and on foot, wielding swords, lances, maces, and shields. They faced sieges that could last months, battles in mud and rain, and enemies just as skilled as they were. There was no room for hesitation or mercy. For all the romanticism around knightly duels and codes of honor, real combat was messy, terrifying, and deadly. But not all of a knight's life was soaked in blood. There were also moments of celebration and prestige. Jousting tournaments became popular in the later Middle Ages, allowing knights to display their martial skills in front of cheering crowds. These tournaments were dangerous but deeply respected. Victories could earn a knight fame, wealth, and favor from the nobility. They were part sport, part spectacle, and part military training. Many knights traveled great distances to compete, seeking honor on the tournament field as eagerly as on the battlefield. Chivalry was the guiding code for knights, but it wasn't always followed perfectly. The chivalric code demanded bravery, honor, and courtesy, especially toward women and the weak. It expected knights to fight for justice, protect the church, and serve their lords faithfully. In reality, many knights were far from noble. Some abused their power, raided villages, or fought for personal gain rather than principle. But the ideal of chivalry shaped the culture and gave knights a moral framework to aspire to, even if they didn't always live up to it. Daily life varied depending on status and time of peace. When not at war, knights spent their time overseeing their estates, training for combat, attending court, and maintaining their equipment. Armor and weapons were costly, and required constant care. Horses needed feeding and grooming. Castles needed defending and managing. Life as a knight was expensive. From the warhorse to the plate armor, the lifestyle demanded wealth or a powerful patron. Poorer knights often served as vassals to wealthier lords in exchange for land or payment. Marriage was often strategic. Knights married to secure alliances, gain land, or elevate their social standing. Love was not always the main concern. However, some found companionship in their marriages, and many took seriously their roles as husbands and fathers. Family honor was tightly woven into a knight's identity. Passing on a legacy of service and bravery was a point of pride. Religion also played a central role. Knights were expected to defend the church and live with a sense of divine purpose. Pilgrimages, donations to monasteries, and fighting in crusades were all ways a knight could express his faith. The Crusades, in particular, drew thousands of knights into faraway lands, promising spiritual reward for martial service. These campaigns were brutal and often politically complex, but they underscored how deeply faith was tied to the knight's worldview. As time passed, the role of the knight began to change. The introduction of professional armies, longbows, and gunpowder weapons diminished the dominance of armored cavalry. By the late Middle Ages, knights were no longer the unstoppable force on the battlefield they had once been. But their cultural legacy endured. The image of the noble knight persisted in stories, ballads, and legends, long after the age of chivalry had faded. Being a knight wasn't just about shining armor and heroic deeds. It was about discipline, duty, and sacrifice. It meant living a life shaped by loyalty to your lord, your people, your God. It meant risking death in war, managing land in peace, and upholding a code that demanded you rise above the common man. It was an identity, a calling, and a burden all in one. To walk in a knight's footsteps is to feel the weight of iron, the sting of cold wind on a dawn patrol, and the pressure of watching eyes as you ride into court or combat. It's a life of both glory and hardship, revered in history and romanticized in myth. But behind every shining helmet was a man, shaped by blood, sweat, prayer, and duty. And while the age of knights has long passed, their stories continue to inspire. Whether noble or flawed, these warriors carved their place into history with sword and will. Their world was brutal, their code was strict, but their legacy lives on in tales of bravery. In the ruins of castles, and in the very idea that one person can stand for something greater than themselves. If this glimpse into the life of a medieval knight has changed the way you see those steel-clad warriors of the past, then mission accomplished. Being a knight wasn't just about honor and glory, it was about relentless discipline, crushing responsibility, and constant risk. Behind the armor was a real person, shaped by years of training, faith, and a duty to protect, lead, and fight. It was a life full of ceremony, hardship, and occasional moments of triumph, all under the watchful eyes of lords, kings, and the church. Next time you hear tales of dragons or sea knights in a movie, remember the real people behind those legends. Their lives were far from fairy tales, but their courage, loyalty, and drive left a mark on history that still fascinates us today. If you enjoyed this journey into the medieval world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We've got so many more stories to uncover of grit, grandeur, and the people who helped shape the world as we know it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep your curiosity sharp and your spirit brave. You never know what corner of the past we'll explore next.